The vote was already decided before I walked into the chamber. I knew it the moment I saw the seating. 41 delegates arranged in a perfect half circle, their chairs angled slightly away from mine. One seat, one table, one small glass of water that nobody had bothered to refill. They had moved my position 3 rows back from the central floor. A small insult, but a deliberate one. These beings had been doing this for centuries. They knew exactly how to make a species feel small before the words were even spoken. My name is Kale Oris. I was 62 years old on the day they expelled us, and I had spent 31 of those years learning how to read a room full of aliens. I was good at it. That was the only reason Earth had kept sending me back. The chamber of the Galactic Conclave is not beautiful. People imagine it would be, given that it houses the representatives of 42 intelligent species, but it smells like recycled atmosphere and old decisions. The walls are a dull gray-green, lit from panels that hum at a frequency just low enough to feel in your back teeth. The floor is polished to a mirror finish, and when you walk across it, your reflection walks beneath you like a ghost. I had walked across it hundreds of times. That morning, watching my own reflection move under my feet, I noticed it looked tired. I sat down. I did not straighten my jacket. I did not smile. Councillor Vretham of the Vorn species called the session to order. He was tall, thin-limbed, with a voice like a string instrument played slowly. He had never liked me. He had told me so, once, with a sincerity I actually respected. At least he was honest about it. He read the motion aloud without looking at me. The motion stated, in the formal language of the conclave, that the species known as Terran humanity had demonstrated, over a period of 412 standard years of galactic membership, a persistent pattern of behavior inconsistent with the values of the conclave. It listed things: emotional volatility in treaty negotiations, unilateral intervention in the affairs of member species without full council approval, repeated refusal to adopt standardized resource protocols, introduction of what the motion called inefficient compassion-based governance models into shared administrative frameworks. I had read the motion 3 weeks before this session. I had read it many times. The language was careful. They had taken time with it. I gave them credit for that. Vretham set the document down and looked at me for the first time. "Ambassador Oris," he said, "the conclave formally invites a response from the Terran delegation before the vote is recorded." I looked at him. Then I looked at all of them, one by one, moving slowly around the half-circle. Some met my eyes. Most did not. The Kalhari representative, a being with 4 amber eyes arranged in a wide band across her forehead, was the only one who held my gaze for more than a second. She looked like she had something to say, and had decided not to say it. I made a note of that. "I don't have a response," I said. The chamber went quiet in the particular way that large rooms go quiet when something unexpected happens. A few delegates shifted in their seats. Someone's translation implant clicked. Vretham tilted his head. "You are formally declining to address the motion?" "I am formally declining," I said. He blinked his inner eyelids, which on a Vorn is the equivalent of a very long pause. "Ambassador, this is a significant proceeding. The Terran delegation has historically been vocal in such sessions." "I'm aware," I said. He waited. I did not fill the silence. The vote was 41 to 1. My vote, the one against, was recorded for the historical file. It would read, forever, that Earth had voted to remain. Which was true. We had. We just hadn't expected to change anything by doing it. When the result was announced, a low murmur moved through the chamber. Not celebration, these were too composed for that, but a kind of collective exhale, the sound of a decision that had been building for a long time finally being made. I sat still and let it pass over me like weather. Vretham spoke again. "The Terran delegation will be provided with a standard transition communicator to maintain emergency contact during the withdrawal period. Full disconnection from conclave networks will occur within 30 standard days. The conclave expresses its regret." "That part," I said, "you can leave out." He stopped. "The part about regret," I said. "It's in the standard language, I know. But it isn't true, and we both know it isn't true. You can leave it out." He looked at me for a long time. Then he closed the document. "Very well." A junior aide brought the communicator to my table. It was a small device, flat and gray, the kind of thing you could lose in a coat pocket. Standard conclave issue. It connected to every frequency in the network. It was, they imagined, a kindness. I picked it up. I looked at it for a moment. Then I held it out across the table and set it down in front of the aide. "Thank you," I said. "We won't need it." The aide looked at the communicator, then at me, then back at the communicator. I stood up. I straightened my jacket. I took one last look at the chamber, at the gray-green walls, at the mirror floor, at 41 beings who had just made the most consequential error in the 400-year history of their organization, and I walked out. My footsteps echoed. My reflection walked beneath me, all the way to the door. Nobody called after me. Outside, in the long corridor that ran from the chamber to the docking bays, my aide, a young man named Owen Clark, fell into step beside me. Owen was 26, sharp, and had the particular gift of knowing when not to speak. He had worked with me for 3 years, and I trusted him more than almost anyone. We walked for 30 seconds in silence. "Well," Owen said finally. "Yes," I said. They looked surprised. "When you handed back the communicator." "They expected emotion," I said. "They built the whole proceeding around the expectation of emotion. A speech, an appeal, maybe raised voices." I paused. "They have been studying human behavior for 400 years, and they still don't understand that the most human thing in the world is knowing when to stop talking." Owen was quiet for a moment. "What happens now?" I thought of the council meeting that had taken place 6 months earlier, in a basement room in Geneva, with 16 people and no recording devices. I thought of the woman who had run that meeting, a physicist named Eleanor Marsh, who had stood at a whiteboard for 4 hours and drawn diagrams with a blue marker, while everyone in the room slowly understood what she was proposing. I thought of what she had said at the end, when everyone had agreed. "They think they're closing a door. They don't know we built our own." "Now," I said to Owen, "we go home." Our ship left dock within the hour. I stood at the observation window as the station fell away behind us, its lights shrinking into the dark. I did not feel what I expected to feel. No anger, no grief, something quieter than both. I felt like a person who had just finished a very long argument and realized, halfway through, that winning the argument had never been the point. The communicator sat on the table behind the aide's console at the conclave. I imagined it sitting there for a long time, waiting for a signal that would never come. I imagined dust settling on it, slowly, in the recycled air. We did not look back. The coordinates were already set. We went home. The 30 days of official withdrawal period that the conclave had granted us passed without a single message from Earth to the network. Not one, not even a formality. Vretham noted this in his personal logs. I would read them years later, obtained through means I prefer not to specify, and wrote that the silence was, quote, consistent with a civilization entering decline. He shared this interpretation with 4 other senior delegates. They agreed with him. None of them considered the other explanation, because none of them had ever known a human who stayed silent by choice. On the 31st day, our last ship passed out of conclave network range. The signal vanished from their trackers like a light going out. They moved on. The galaxy moved on. We got to work. 30 years is a long time if you spend it waiting. It is almost no time at all if you spend it building. My name is Lena Vasquez, and for 22 of those 30 years, I lived mostly underground. Not because I had to. The facility we worked in, a long series of connected structures dug into the rock beneath the Canadian Shield, accessed by roads that appeared on no public map and labeled on internal documents simply as Site 4, had windows, real ones, not screens, long horizontal slits cut into the stone at ground level, angled to catch the morning light. On clear days, if I was in the right corridor at the right hour, I could watch the sun rise over a frozen lake and feel, for a few minutes, like an ordinary person. I was not an ordinary person. None of us were, and we all knew it. And we didn't talk about it much because there was always more work to do. I was a propulsion engineer. Specifically, I specialized in what the conclave had called, during our 400 years of membership, auxiliary drive systems, the compact, efficient engines used for in-system travel, planetary orbit work, short-range freight. The kind of thing nobody paid much attention to because it was practical rather than spectacular. For most of our galactic membership, we had purchased our drive components from the Kelhari, who made them best, and our fuel processing systems from the Vorn, who made those best, and so on down the list. The Conclave's entire economic architecture was built on this principle. Everyone did the one thing they were best at, and everyone bought everything else. It was elegant. It also meant that when they expelled you, you couldn't do much of anything on your own. That was the plan anyway. What they hadn't counted on was that humans had been taking things apart since before we had a word for engineering. Not maliciously. We just couldn't leave things alone. Every drive component we had ever purchased from the Kelhari had been disassembled, analyzed, scanned, cataloged, and put back together by at least a dozen separate teams across 3 different countries before it was ever installed on a working ship. We called it maintenance. It was also, quietly, education. Eleanor Marsh had understood this better than anyone. She was not an engineer. She was a theoretical physicist who had spent most of her career at a small research institute in Edinburgh, working on a class of problems so abstract that most of her colleagues, when asked to explain her work at dinner parties, would say something vague about space-time and change the subject. She was also, as it turned out, the person who had figured out, 8 years before the conclave vote, that it was coming. She had written a paper, not a public one, a paper circulated to 23 people in specific government positions, with a specific set of graphs attached, showing the trajectory of conclave sentiment toward humanity over the previous 40 years. The graphs were not complicated. The conclusion was, they are going to remove us, and when they do, we will have somewhere between 30 and 50 years before the damage becomes irreversible. We need to use that time correctly. Here is what correctly means. I had read that paper. It had changed my life in the specific, permanent way that things change your life, when they force you to see clearly something you had been choosing not to look at. I arrived at Site 4 with 12 suitcases, and a clear idea of what I was walking into. I would not have called it courage. It felt more like the simple act of going where you were most needed, which is a different thing. For the first 3 years, we did nothing but catalog. We took every piece of alien technology that Earth had legally acquired, licensed, or independently developed during our years of membership, and we mapped it. Every component, every process, every dependency chain, meaning every instance where making thing A required having thing B, which required thing C, which was manufactured only on a planet we no longer had access to. The dependency maps were long, they were honest. We put them on the wall of the main meeting room and looked at them every morning. The rule Eleanor had written at the top of every planning document was simple. No despair in working hours. The problems were problems. They had solutions, or they didn't. Our job was to find out which. Most had solutions. The Kelhari drive systems, which I worked on personally, had seemed, at first, impossibly intricate. The Kelhari had been refining their propulsion technology for 600 years. Their smallest commercial engine contained over 40,000 distinct components, many of them manufactured to tolerances that, when we first encountered them, we had assumed required technologies we did not possess. We did not assume that anymore. The first 3 years of cataloging gave way to 4 years of reverse engineering, which was the most difficult and the most interesting work I had ever done. Our team was 11 people at peak. We slept 4 hours a night for months at a stretch, not because anyone demanded it, but because the problem was too interesting to walk away from. I do not recommend this schedule. I also do not regret it. By year 7, we had rebuilt a working Kelhari drive from components manufactured entirely on Earth. It was 11% less efficient than the original and twice the size. We called it a start. By year 12, we had matched efficiency. By year 16, we had exceeded it. I remember the day we ran the first full test of the year 16 engine. We were in a deep test bay, concrete walls 3 meters thick, monitors stacked along one wall, everyone wearing the same expression. The expression people wear when they have worked on something for so long that they have lost the ability to predict whether it will work or not, and they are simply waiting to find out. The engine came online. The readings climbed. Someone said a word under their breath that I will not repeat here. Then everyone was quiet, watching the numbers. It ran. It ran clean. It ran better than anything the Kelhari had ever sold us. A man named Peter Okafor, who was the quietest member of our team and almost never showed emotion at work, sat down very slowly on the floor and put his face in his hands. Not from distress. He just needed a moment. We all understood. We left him to it. That was our 12th year of isolation. We had 18 more to go, and the drive was only one of many problems. But the drive was the one that had felt impossible. And it was done. Something shifted in the facility after that day. Not confidence, exactly. Something quieter. A kind of certainty that the rest could be done too, because this had been done. We didn't celebrate much. There was no time. But someone brought a bottle of very old whiskey from somewhere, and we passed it around the test bay, and Peter Okafor stood up off the floor and took a long drink and smiled, and that was enough. The years that followed were full of problems, and full of solutions, and occasionally full of failures, that sent us back 3 months on a timeline we had no room to slip. I won't pretend it was always magnificent. Some of it was grim, grinding work that felt like walking through wet concrete. Some of it was lonely in a way that is hard to describe. The kind of lonely that comes not from being alone but from working on something so large and so secret that you cannot explain it to the people you love most. My sister called me every week for 15 years, and I told her I was working on transportation systems. Which was true, just not completely. There were things I missed. I missed the Galactic Network, not for the political access but for the sheer volume of knowledge it had contained. Millennia of accumulated science from 42 species, all of it searchable, most of it freely licensed. We had downloaded everything we legally had access to in the weeks before disconnection, and we were grateful for it. But downloads are a snapshot. The network had been alive, constantly updated, constantly debated, constantly growing. Working without it felt, in the early years, like trying to navigate with an old photograph of a map. But here is the thing about working without a net. You build one. What we created in those 30 years was not just technology. It was a body of knowledge that was distinctly, purely human. We had started from alien blueprints and alien principles, but the directions we took from there were our own. The questions we asked were the ones we would have asked regardless of what the Kelhari or the Vorn had ever taught us, because they were the questions humans have always asked. Can this be smaller? Can this be faster? Can this be done with fewer moving parts? What happens if we push it further than the designer intended? What happens if we are not careful about the rules someone else made up? Some of what we produced in those 30 years was practical. Better engines, better life support, better materials for long-duration space travel, better food production systems, better water recycling, better medical tools that required no external supply chain at all. We had arrived at this project knowing we could not afford dependencies, and we ended it having systematically eliminated almost everyone we had. Some of what we produced was not practical in any immediate sense. Eleanor Marsh's own work continued in a small office at the edge of Site 4, where she worked mostly alone, and communicated in long written notes that she slid under doors because she found talking while thinking inefficient. Had gone somewhere that I will not describe in detail here, because I did not fully understand it, and I am not willing to describe things I don't understand. What I will say is that her final note, slid under my door in year 27, contained 3 pages of equations and 1 sentence at the bottom that read, "I think we found the thing they don't know exists." I read that sentence approximately 40 times. There was one other event in those 30 years that I should mention, because I was present for it, and because it mattered more than most people know. In year 19, a conclave survey probe entered our solar system. It was a standard automated scout, the kind the conclave sent through uninhabited or low-priority systems, as part of a routine mapping program. It passed through the outer edge of our system, near the orbit of Neptune, at a standard survey speed. It was programmed to collect data and transmit it back to the network. We had known it was coming for 6 months. We had a very good early warning system by then, which was itself a product of the first decade of work. We tracked the probe from the moment it crossed the system boundary, which it did not expect, because probe designers do not generally expect expelled species to have tracking capacity they hadn't had when they left. We did not shoot it down. There was a long discussion about what to do, and several people argued for destruction, and I understood the argument but disagreed with it. Eleanor's note on the subject, slid under the door of the main planning room, was 4 words: "Let it go home." What we did instead was intercept its transmission stream, the data it collected and packaged for conclave relay, and replace it. Not with false data. We simply removed anything that would have revealed what we had built. What the probe sent back to the conclave was an accurate picture of a solar system with a small, quiet population on the third planet. Unremarkable electromagnetic emissions, no anomalous structures, no unusual energy signatures. A species, the data implied, that was getting along quietly, keeping to themselves. Declining slowly, as expected. Then we sent the probe on its way, course corrected by 2 degrees, so it would arrive back at its home station slightly behind schedule. Just enough to suggest it had encountered some minor navigation drift, not enough to trigger any investigation. The conclave logged the data. Vretham, I later learned, reviewed it personally and wrote a single-line note in his administrative file. Terrans, stable, non-threatening, no intervention required. Peter Okafor framed that note when we eventually obtained it. He hung it in the test bay, next to the first engine we had ever built together. Beneath it, he wrote one line of his own. They had no idea. He was right. They had no idea. And we still had 11 more years to go. I spent most of my career watching a galaxy that had forgotten Earth existed. My name is Mira Shen, and my job, for 15 years, was to listen. Not in any poetic sense. Literally, I sat at a monitoring station in a facility built into the side of a cliff in the Faroe Islands, surrounded by equipment that would not have looked out of place in the Conclave's own intelligence division, and I listened to everything the Galactic Network was saying about itself. The transmission streams that reached us by then were not stolen. They were intercepted from public broadcast bands, the kind of low-priority diplomatic traffic that gets sent without heavy encryption, because nobody imagines a disconnected species has the ability to receive it. We had the ability to receive it. By year 22 of our isolation, we had the ability to receive most of it. My team was 7 people. We worked in shifts, never fewer than 3 of us in the room at any hour, because the information came continuously, and gaps were dangerous. We translated, we archived, we flagged what was urgent, and we wrote daily summaries that went by secure courier to Site 4 and to a second facility I was not allowed to know the location of, which I assumed was where Eleanor Marsh was. What we found, over those years, was not what anyone had expected to find. The galaxy without humanity was not simply continuing, it was shifting, in slow and structural ways, and not for the better. The first thing I noticed, in the second year of my assignment, was a change in the pattern of conclave votes. Before our expulsion, the historical record showed that on major resolutions, there had always been a predictable cluster of dissenting votes, 6 to 9 usually, representing the smaller species and newer members who routinely objected to the decisions of the dominant powers. Humanity had almost always voted with this cluster, not because we were instructed to, but because we consistently sided with the position that needed arguing for, the one that wasn't going to win on its own, the one that had merit, but no political weight. It was, as one of my colleagues once put it, a deeply human instinct, to root for the underdog, even when the underdog's cause was inconvenient to your own interests. Without us, that cluster shrank. Within 5 years of our expulsion, dissenting votes on major resolutions had dropped to an average of 2 or 3, sometimes 0. The conclave began passing resolutions with near unanimous support that previously would have taken months of negotiation to achieve. On the surface, this looked like progress. Vretham wrote a long report about it titled something that translated roughly as "The Benefits of Harmonious Governance," and it was widely circulated and well received. I read it and felt cold. A governing body that passes everything unanimously is not harmonious. It is stagnant. It is an organization that has stopped arguing, which means it has stopped thinking. The arguments had been annoying and inefficient, and occasionally very loud, and usually human in origin, and they had, as it turned out, been doing something important. By year 5 after our expulsion, 3 smaller species in the outer conclave territories, the Merit, the Facile, and a species with a name that didn't translate well but whose records we labeled internally as the River People, had experienced serious economic contractions, not collapses, not yet, but the kind of steady, grinding decline that is hard to stop once it begins. Each of them had previously relied on trade agreements that had been brokered, in part, through conclave mediation, that had included human negotiators. Human negotiators, I had learned in my years of study, had a specific reputation in the conclave. We were considered exhausting. We were known for extending negotiations that other species considered finished, for raising points that everyone else had agreed to set aside, for caring about outcomes that did not directly benefit Earth, and then explaining, at length, why everyone should care about them too. Vretham, in his personal logs, had described human diplomats as having the social instincts of a species that had not yet learned when to stop pushing. He was not wrong. We had not learned when to stop pushing. We had also, it turned out, been the reason that 3 smaller species were still economically viable. Without the pushing, the agreements that sustained them quietly expired. The replacement agreements were less favorable. The Marit protested. The Facile filed formal objections. The river people sent a delegation to the conclave capital that waited for 3 weeks for a meeting that was repeatedly deferred and finally granted as a 15-minute session with a junior administrative committee. I read the transcript of that session. The head of the river people's delegation, a being whose title translated roughly as voice of the water, said 14 things. The committee acknowledged 2 of them. The meeting ended. The delegation went home. Nothing changed. In year 8, there were 2 armed conflicts in the mid-conclave territories. One between the Vorn and a species called the Ashteri, over resource extraction rights, near a shared boundary. One between 2 minor species whose names I will not attempt here, over an old territorial dispute that had previously been managed by a rotating mediation framework that had, it emerged, quietly depended on human delegates for 2/3 of its active sessions. Both conflicts were eventually resolved. One took 11 months. One took 3 years. Combined, they resulted in the destruction of 4 populated stations, significant casualties on both sides of each conflict, and a conclave resolution passed, unanimously, naturally, that condemned violence and called for restraint. I wrote a summary of both conflicts and flagged them as Category 2 priority for Site 4. In the notes section, I wrote what I always wrote when something significant happened. File for the record. Do not act. Not yet. The rule was Eleanor's. It was not cruel. It was logical. We were not ready, and acting before we were ready would only tell the galaxy we were watching, which would tell them we were more capable than they believed, which would change the way they thought about us before we were in a position to benefit from that change. Patience, Eleanor had written in her original document, is not inaction. Patience is the correct form of action when the correct time has not yet arrived. I believed this. I still believe it. But I will admit that there were nights, sitting at my monitoring station with the Faroe Islands wind rattling the ventilation seals and the data scrolling past, when I found it very difficult. Year 11 brought the message that I still think about the most. It came through a low-priority diplomatic channel, the kind used for personal correspondence between senior delegates. Technically private, practically not, since anything transmitted through the conclave network at any priority level was, by then, something we could read. It was a message from a Vorn diplomat named Vreth Kas, a younger relative of Vreth Am, I later learned, to a colleague at the Kelhari embassy. The message was short. It said, in translation, strange question, but do you know if there is any way to reach the Terrans? Not officially, just to talk. There are some things I keep trying to raise in committee and cannot get traction on. A colleague mentioned, once, that the humans had a way of making people listen. I don't know what I'm hoping for. Ignore this if it's strange. The Kelhari diplomat's response, 3 days later. I don't know how to reach them. I don't think anyone does. I looked it up, actually. Their last listed contact address is still the communicator they left at the chamber desk. Someone noted in the log that it was never collected. I don't know if it still works. I read that exchange 4 times. Then I set it aside and went back to work, because that was what the rule required. But I saved it. I labeled it simply as First Inquiry. I had a sense that it would not be the last. I was right. By year 15, my archive of similar messages numbered 63. Different species, different channels, different questions. Some were political, people trying to find a back channel for negotiation support. Some were personal, old diplomatic contacts trying to reach individuals they had worked with, wondering if they were well. One was from a Kelhari scientist who had co-authored a paper with a human researcher and wanted to continue the collaboration. She had sent 6 messages over 4 years. each one slightly shorter than the last, until they stopped. That one I found hardest. None of the 63 messages received a response. That was the rule. That had always been the rule. We were not there to be convenient. We were there to become necessary, and those are very different things. By year 20, the conclave had experienced 5 significant diplomatic failures, 2 economic crises in its outer territories, 1 internal restructuring that changed nothing in practice, and a general atmosphere, readable in the pattern of private correspondence, where people say what they actually think, of institutional fatigue, not collapse, not crisis, the slow, accumulating weight of an organization that had been running in the same direction for so long that it could no longer see why. The small Kelhari ambassador with the amber eyes, the one who had held my gaze during the vote, her name, I learned from records, was Sul Emhari, had been promoted to a senior council position. She had used that position, in year 17, to push a resolution calling for a formal review of the conclave's policy on expelled species. The resolution had been tabled. In year 19, she pushed it again. It was tabled again. She was reassigned to a less influential committee position shortly afterward, in a move that was described administratively as a restructuring. I flagged her name in my files. I wrote next to it, "She knows." Our last year of isolation, year 30, was the busiest I had known. Not because of the galaxy. Because of us. Site 4 had grown, over the years, into something that no longer fit neatly into any category. It was a research facility, a manufacturing site, a library, a school for the several hundred children who had been born there, to parents who had committed their lives to the project. Peter Okafor's daughter had grown up in those corridors. She was 19 now, and had joined the engineering team. She worked on the same propulsion problems her father had worked on, and had already, in 3 years, found 2 solutions he hadn't. Eleanor Marsh was 74. She still worked. Her notes were longer than ever. The year 30 milestone was not marked by anything public. There was no ceremony. People kept working. But there was a meeting, in the main planning room at Site 4, that included Eleanor and Peter and 15 others, and one very old man who appeared on a screen from a small house on the south coast of England. That man was me. Cale Orris, retired ambassador, called back to a meeting I had been waiting 30 years to attend. Eleanor presented the status. She was direct. She always had been. We were ready, she said. Not just ready. We had exceeded every target in the original plan. We had done what she had proposed in that basement in Geneva, and then we had done more than that, because that is what happens when you give humans 30 years and a reason. She went through the list. I will not reproduce it here in full, but the items on it represented 3 decades of human ingenuity, applied without interruption, without negotiation, without having to justify each step to a committee of species who had already decided they knew better. We had not been held back by partnership. We had not been constrained by trade agreements or technology licenses, or the 1,000 small restrictions that come with belonging to an organization designed by beings who, for all their age and intelligence, had stopped being curious somewhere along the way. We had been free, and we had used the freedom correctly. At the end of the presentation, Eleanor looked at the screen where I was sitting. "Cale," she said, "we need to decide when." "Not yet," I said. "We wait for them to come to us." She nodded. She had expected that answer. "And if they don't?" "They will," I said. I was not certain, but I was close to certain. 63 messages in Mira's archive. A pattern of failures that was becoming impossible to ignore. Sul Emhari reassigned, for asking the right question. A galaxy that had expelled its most inconvenient member, and was now discovering, slowly and painfully, what inconvenience had been holding together. They would come. The only question was how long they would take to admit it. The answer was 8 more months. I was 91 years old when Owen Clark knocked on my door. Owen was no longer young. He was 57, gray at the temples, and he had run the Department of External Readiness for the past 12 years, which was the official name for the small office that existed solely to prepare for the day someone from outside decided to contact us. He had prepared extensively. He had run simulations. He had written protocols. He had, over the years, grown somewhat resigned to the possibility that the day might never come. He did not look resigned when he knocked on my door. "They're here," he said. "Outer system, 7 ships, conclave diplomatic configuration, broadcasting on every open frequency." I was sitting in an armchair by the window of my house in Devon. It was early morning. There was fog on the hillside. I had been reading a book that had nothing to do with aliens or politics or engineering, because I had learned, in retirement, that the mind needs rooms that are not about the important thing. I put the book down carefully, with the spine up to hold my page. "What are they saying?" I asked. Owen handed me a transcript. I read it once. The message was formal, careful, and underneath the formal language, unmistakably desperate. The conclave, it said, wished to open a dialogue with the Terran government regarding matters of mutual interest. The conclave expressed its desire to review certain historical decisions in light of changed circumstances. The conclave extended its deepest respect. The deepest respect. I set the transcript on the arm of the chair. "They expected us to be smaller," I said. "After 30 years. "Yes," Owen said. "And they're realizing we're not." "They haven't seen everything yet," Owen said. "They've only seen what our outer stations allowed them to see, which is enough," I said. "Enough to worry them." He nodded. I looked at the fog on the hillside for a moment. 30 years. I had handed back a communicator 30 years ago, and walked out of a chamber and never looked back, not because I was certain of what would happen next, but because Eleanor Marsh had shown me a set of graphs and written a plan so clear and so carefully thought through that doubt had not been an option. Eleanor had died in year 28. She had not lived to see this morning. I thought of her as I stood up from my armchair, not with grief exactly, but with the specific feeling of wanting very much to tell someone something, and knowing you cannot. She had known. In her way, working in that small office at the edge of Site 4, sliding notes under doors, she had always known. "Tell them we'll meet," I said. "1 ship, our coordinates, no weapons." Owen made a note. "Any message beyond that?" I thought for a moment. "Tell them we'll make time for them, in 3 days." He looked at me. 3 days? "We're very busy," I said. We were not very busy, but 3 days was the correct amount of time, long enough to signal that this meeting was not urgent to us. Short enough to be civil. Owen understood. 3 days, he said. "And Owen," I said, reaching for my jacket, which had been on the hook by the door for 12 years. "Find someone to press this. I've let it go a bit." He looked at the jacket. He looked at me. "Of course," he said. "The meeting took place aboard our ship, our design, our manufacturing, our materials, which were the point, in a conference room that was comfortable and undecorated. No flags, no symbols. A long table, chairs, water, light that came from panels that did not hum. We had fixed that detail specifically. We wanted no background frequencies in their back teeth. 7 of them came. Vreth Kas, the young Vorn diplomat whose message Mira had flagged 11 years ago, led the delegation. He was older now, of course, more composed. He had prepared for this meeting. I could see it in the way he arranged himself at the table, the careful posture, the even breathing, the notes he did not look at, because he had memorized them. Sul Emhari was not in the delegation. I had hoped she would be. I noted her absence without commenting on it. Vreth Kas opened. He spoke for a long time. He was articulate, thorough, and honest in the specific way that experienced diplomats are honest, selecting true things carefully, in a sequence designed to lead somewhere. He covered the years since our departure. He covered the economic challenges in the outer territories. He described, with surprising candor, some of the diplomatic failures, framing them as consequences of complicated circumstances, rather than of our absence, but not strongly enough to be convincing. He covered what the conclave was proposing, a framework for re-engagement, gradual readmission, structured participation. He did not apologize. I had not expected one. When he finished, the room was quiet. His delegation sat still. Their expressions were controlled. I had said nothing for 2 hours. I was good at that. I had learned it from Eleanor, who had learned it from somewhere else, and it was one of those skills that becomes more powerful the longer you practice it. I looked at Vreth Kas for a moment. "What would you like from us?" I said. He blinked. It was not the response he had prepared for. He had prepared for negotiation, for counter-proposal, for a list of demands. He had prepared for human emotion, for 30 years of grievance, expressed loudly across a table. He had prepared for almost everything. He had not prepared for a simple question asked without any edge in it. "We would like," he said carefully, "to restore the relationship between Earth and the Conclave in a way that—" "I don't mean that," I said, gently. "The formal version I understand. What do you actually need? Not what the Conclave wants. What do you need?" He stopped. Something moved across his face that I had not seen on a Vorn diplomat before, something honest. He said the names of 3 species: the Merit, the Facile, the River People. "They're not going to survive another decade without intervention," he said. "We've tried 4 frameworks. None of them have held. There are 2 people in my department who have worked this problem for 6 years, and they are—" He stopped. Chose a word carefully. "They are at a loss." "We know," I said. He looked at me. "We've been watching," I said. Not to be unkind, because we needed to understand the shape of the problem before we could address it. "We know those 3 situations better than anyone in your department. We've known for 9 years. I set my hands flat on the table. "We can help with them." "What would you want in return?" he asked. "We'll come to that," I said. "But those 3 situations, that help is not a negotiating point. That's just the right thing to do, and we will do it regardless of what else we agree to." He looked at me for a long time. "I don't understand," he said, slowly, "why you would do that, after what was done." "I know you don't," I said. "That's part of what you didn't understand 30 years ago, and it's still part of what you don't understand now. But you will. There's time." He sat back. Something in his posture changed. Not defeat, not submission, but the shift of a person who has been holding a particular tension for a long time and has just been given permission to set it down. We talked for 6 more hours. By the end, there was a framework on the table, not a final agreement, a framework, a structure for what the negotiation would look like, who would be involved, what principles would govern it. The details would take months, possibly years. That was fine. We had learned how to be patient. I will be honest about what the charter said, because history should be honest. It took 11 months to write it. We held the negotiations in neutral space, on a station constructed for the purpose, and dismantled afterward, because we did not want anyone to have home advantage, and we no longer needed to use anyone else's home. The team we sent was led by a woman named Clara Holt, who was 43, and had spent her entire adult life preparing for exactly this kind of work in a department that had, until 8 months ago, had very little to do. She was extraordinary at it in the specific way that people who have prepared thoroughly and waited patiently are extraordinary. She was not brilliant in flashes. She was right, consistently, across 11 months of sustained negotiation with 37 different parties. I visited once, midway through. I sat in the observation room and watched Clara work for an afternoon. She reminded me of Eleanor, not in style. Eleanor had been quiet and internal, while Clara was present and direct, but in the same underlying quality. The quality of someone who has thought a problem through completely and is now simply executing the work. She caught me watching through the glass. She nodded at me. I nodded back. I left the next morning. She didn't need me there. The charter, when it was done, was 31 pages. It was the shortest governing document in Conclave history by a significant margin. Previous major agreements averaged over 200 pages. The length had always been a source of Conclave pride. It signaled thoroughness, they believed, and the weight of consideration that had gone into every clause. Clara had written, in her negotiating notes, that long documents are long because the parties do not trust each other and therefore require every contingency written down. A short document is possible when the principles are clear and the parties have enough respect for each other to handle the contingencies as they arise. She had then spent 4 months getting the conclave to accept this philosophy, which had required more patience than writing the charter itself. The 31 pages covered 3 things: the rights and responsibilities of conclave membership, simplified to a set of principles rather than a set of rules; the framework for dispute resolution, built around mandatory direct dialogue before any escalation, with no exceptions; and the protections for smaller member species, written with more specificity and more teeth than anything the conclave had previously produced. The third section had been Clara's priority from the start, not because she had been instructed to prioritize it, because it was right. The conclave signed it. Not unanimously, because unanimity was no longer the goal. The goal was honest agreement, and honest agreement requires the freedom to disagree. 38 of 42 member species signed on the first day. 2 signed after a week of additional discussion. 2 abstained, which was their right under the Charter's own provisions, and which we respected. There was no ceremony. Clara had declined 1. We signed. We filed. We moved on. There was work to do. The 3 species, the Marit, the Facile, the River People, received the intervention teams within the month. These were not diplomatic teams. They were engineers and economists, and people who were very good at the specific, unglamorous work of making things function again when they have stopped functioning. The teams were all human, which caused some comment in the conclave, and which we did not apologize for, because they were the best people for the job and we knew they were. The Merit situation turned around in 14 months. The Facile took 3 years. The River People are still ongoing, but the trajectory changed within the first year, and their delegation, when they came to meet with Clara's team for the first review, brought something they had made from a material local to their planet, a small woven object, and gave it to the lead engineer without explanation. He accepted it and thanked them and carried it in his pocket for the rest of the mission. I did not gloat. That is the thing I most want to be clear about, because the history will record these events, and I want the record to be accurate. No one gloated, not publicly and not privately, not even in the moments when it would have been very easy and perhaps understandable to do so. We had not spent 30 years building something so that we could lord it over the people who had excluded us. We had spent 30 years building something because it was right to build it, and because we were the ones who could. The species that had voted to expel us came to understand this, over time, in different ways and at different speeds. Vrethkos was the first to say something about it explicitly. He said it to me, in a private conversation near the end of the charter negotiations, in a corridor outside the main meeting room on the neutral station. He said, "We studied you for 400 years. We thought we understood what you would do when pushed. We were wrong." "What did you think we would do?" I asked. "We thought you would fight," he said, "or fall apart. Those were the 2 options our models produced." "You had a third option," I said. "You just didn't model it." He looked at me. "You could have considered," I said, "that we might simply go home and work." He was quiet for a moment. "Why didn't you fight?" he asked. "You had reason to." I thought about how to answer. I thought about Eleanor, drawing on that whiteboard in Geneva. I thought about Peter Okafor sitting on the floor of the test bay. I thought about Mira Shen, in a room on a cliff in the Faroes, reading 63 messages that she could not answer. "Anger burns fuel," I said. "We needed the fuel." He didn't answer, but I think he understood. The communicator, the one I had left on the table in the conclave chamber 30 years ago, was returned to me by courier 6 months after the charter was signed. Someone had located it in an administrative archive where it had been sitting, categorized under uncollected Terran property, for 3 decades. They had sent it wrapped carefully, with a note that said only, "We found this. We thought you might want it back." I unwrapped it at my kitchen table in Devon on a quiet morning. It was exactly as I remembered it. Flat, gray, smaller than I expected, given how large it had seemed at the time. I turned it over in my hands. My granddaughter was visiting that week. She was 12, curious about everything, and had been asking me questions for 3 days about what I had done before I retired. I had answered as well as I could, which is to say imperfectly, because some things are difficult to explain to someone who has grown up in the world those things created. She was standing in the doorway of the kitchen when I unwrapped it. She came and sat across from me and looked at the communicator. "What is it?" she asked. "Something I left behind, once," I said. She picked it up and examined it. "Does it work?" "I imagine so," I said. "It was made well." "What did it do?" "It was a way for them to reach us," I said. "They gave it to us so we would always be available to them, so we would never be out of contact." She turned it over. "But you left it there." "Yes." "Why?" I looked at the communicator in her small hands, at the thing that had seemed, to 41 delegates, like a lifeline extended to a species that was about to need one, at the thing that was, In fact, nothing more than a symbol of the assumption that we would always be the ones waiting to be called. Because, I said, we weren't going to need it. And I wanted them to understand that, eventually. Even if it took a long time. She set it back on the table. She looked at it for a moment. Did they understand? She asked. Yes, I said. It just took them 30 years. She was quiet for a moment, the way children are quiet when they are genuinely thinking, rather than pretending to think. Then she said, "That must have been a long time to wait." "It was," I said, "but we were busy." I picked up the communicator. I turned it on for the first time. The screen lit up. There was a new message on it, sent to this address 2 days ago, from a Vorn diplomatic office. It read, "Ambassador Oris, we hope you are well. We have some matters we would like your perspective on, when you have time. There is no urgency. We simply value your thoughts." I looked at it for a long time. Then I put it in my jacket pocket, patted it once, and told my granddaughter it was time for breakfast. Some things, I had learned, do not need an immediate response. But it is good to know the channel is open,